Hey guys, Pastor Roy here coming to you from Grove Kids once again. Yeah, we're still in our homes, I know, but it's okay. We're going to get through this and we're going to have fun doing it. How many of you are having fun at home? How many are like, I'm ready to get out of the house? I know some of us are. But here we are. We're still doing this. And it kind of reminds me of the word that we're starting. You know, every month we have a new word. And today's word, starting for this month, is perseverance. Do you know what perseverance means? It's a big word, isn't it? Perseverance means to keep going, to go the long distance, to see something from the beginning to the end. I kind of like to use the word stick-to-itiveness. That's even a funnier word, isn't it? Sounds like something Pastor Andrew would say, stick-to-itiveness. It means that we can get through things even when they get hard. I want to read to you our memory verse today. Our memory verse is Hebrews 12:1, and it says, such a large crowd of witnesses are all around us. So we must get rid of everything that slows us down, especially the sin that won't let us go. And we must be determined to run the race that is ahead of us. We must keep our eyes on Jesus, who leads us and makes our faith complete. He endured the shame of being nailed to the cross because he knew later on he would be glad that he did. Now he is seated at the right hand of God. So keep your mind on Jesus, who put up with many insults from sinners. They won't get discouraged. Then you won't get discouraged and give up. You know, that's a lot of verses just to say, hey, keep going. Don't give up. How many of you have ever given up? There's been times that I've started something and then gave up halfway. And I've often looked back at those things and go, man, I should have finished that. What would it have been if I'd have finished that thing? And today we're going to kind of start talking about the fact that we need to persevere. We need to keep on keeping on. We need to run the race. How many of you love to run? Yeah, I don't run a whole lot. You can tell my belly's a little large because I don't run enough. Me and my wife, we do walk, and we were talking about that the other day. And as we were walking through the neighborhood, there was a guy that came running by. He had his sneakers on, his running shoes, and the tight running pants and all that kind of stuff, man. And he just zoomed by us, and he had sweat pouring off of him, and you could tell he had run a long ways. And he was huffing and puffing and panting. But he didn't stop. He kept on going. And as he went by us, he kind of turned around and ran backwards and said good morning to us and everything. And it was really neat to see somebody running and not stopping. They were just doing and persevering and keeping on. So it's kind of, the Bible tells us that our walk with Jesus, our time with Jesus, is like a race. And that we start that race and we will win that race if we finish it. We have to keep going. We have to keep working and trusting and believing in God and letting Him work in our lives. That's how we run the race. And sometimes it gets hard. Sometimes we want to give up. But you know what? No matter how hard it seems or no matter how impossible it seems, God will see us through. And it tells us that we can do all things through Jesus. Does that mean I can fly? Does that mean I'm a person can lay an egg like a bird? No, not all those things, but we can endure all things. We can persevere through all things. We can keep going through all things because God gives us the strength to see it to the end. That's what that verse means. And today we're going to kind of talk about that. And we're going to talk about one of my favorite people in the Bible. We're going to talk about Abraham and Sarah. Abraham and Sarah, God had promised them a great future. Matter of fact, the Bible tells us that God came to Abraham and said, Abraham, look at all the stars. Can you count them? I can just imagine Abraham going, okay, I'm going to count the stars. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, wait, I missed that one. 1, 2. How confusing that would be, trying to count all the stars. And then he said, Abraham, look at the sand. How many grains of sand are there? Man, those are innumerable. That means that there's so many you can't count. It's impossible to count the stars. It's impossible to count the sand. And he said, Abraham, I'm going to make you a great nation with as many people as there are pieces of sand, with as many people as stars in the skies. You're going to be a great nation. Now, at this time, Abraham, it was just he and his wife. And they were like 75 years old. They were already old and didn't have kids. And God said, I'm still going to make you a great nation. So Abraham was so excited to hear this great news that God had for him. But it didn't happen all at once. It didn't happen after a long, long time. Matter of fact, why don't you watch this little video, and it's going to kind of give you the story of Abraham, and then we'll come back and I want to talk to you about some other impossible things and how God can do the impossible when we put our trust in him and follow him through the long road.
God's story, God's promise to Abraham. So part of God's story is about a promise God made to Abraham, and it begins like this. Once there was a guy named Abraham. He had a wife, Sarah. They didn't think they could have any kids, which was a major disappointment because they really wanted a family. But little did Abraham know that God had a very special plan for him. When Abraham was 75 years old, God promised to give him kids, and one day God would send the rescuer through his family. All God asked was that Abraham and Sarah leave their home first and follow him. Now, they had a tough choice to make: leave all their friends and trust God, or stay comfortable. This was not easy. See, Abraham really wanted kids, but was already pretty old. Sarah was getting up there too. Not to mention, she had never been able to get pregnant. So if Abraham and Sarah were going to leave their home and trust in God's promise, they had to believe that God would do something that seemed impossible. The good news is, they decided to trust that God would keep his promise. That's always the right choice. So Abraham and Sarah moved from their home to a land called Canaan. Right away, God reminded Abraham of his promise. He said, I will make your children like the dust of the earth. Can specks of dust be counted? If they can, then your children can be counted. This was God's funny way of telling Abraham he would have a lot of kids, because nobody can count every piece of dust. Well, this promise seemed great, but after a while, Abraham and Sarah still had no kids, let alone as many as the pieces of dust. Now, they were really old. Sometimes God doesn't remind us of his promises because he wants us to learn to trust him. But God took Abraham outside at night and told him to look at the stars. He reminded Abraham that he would give him that many kids. So Abraham decided to keep believing God. He and Sarah waited again. After more years, he got impatient. This time, God told Abraham, by next year, Sarah will have a son. But by now, Abraham was 99 years old. He and Sarah had both given up on having kids and God's promise. In fact, when Abraham told Sarah what God said, she laughed. It's probably not a good idea to laugh at God's promises, but Sarah was tired of waiting and had stopped trusting. The great thing is, even if we think it's impossible, God really does keep his promises. And just like God promised, Sarah got pregnant the next year after Abraham's 100th birthday. When her son was born, she named him Isaac, which means laughter. Sarah said, God has given laughter to me. Everybody who hears about this will laugh with me. And think about it. A really old lady having a baby is pretty funny. God kept his promise to give Abraham and Sarah a son. Even though they didn't think it was possible, it was easy for God because he can do anything, including giving old people babies. And remember how God was going to give Abraham as many children as the stars in the sky? Well, Isaac grew up and had children who had more children who had more children. This kept going and going and going. And guess who eventually was born in Abraham's line? The rescuer himself, God's son, Jesus. All because Abraham followed God and trusted God to keep his promise. And that's the story of God's promise to Abraham. So in case you missed it, here's the quick version. Abraham and Sarah were old. God promised to give Abraham kids. Abraham and Sarah waited. They got impatient. God reminded them he keeps his promises. Abraham and Sarah waited more. They got impatient again. God told them Sarah would have a baby. Sarah laughed. She had a baby. Jesus was eventually born into their family. God always keeps his promises. And that's a part of God's story.
You know, Abraham and Sarah, they had a long go of it. Some of the things that God had promised them seemed okay. Yeah, I can believe that. And then other things like Sarah having a baby after she was so old, she couldn't believe that. What did it say? It said she laughed at that. And they waited for such a long time. To Sarah, it seemed impossible. Have you ever seen something impossible happen? Have you ever seen something so amazing that you thought, wow, there's no way that could be real? You know, God has done some great things, some impossible things. The Word of God tells us that He parted the Red Sea and that Jesus caused blind people to see again. Those are great things. Those were miracles. But there's other things that we see every day. We don't necessarily consider miracles, but maybe they seem impossible. I remember one time I went to the fair and I saw a guy. He had a big top hat on and a big black coat with tails on it. And he was a wizard. Yeah, he wasn't a wizard. He was a magician, but he called himself Willard the Wizard. And he said, "Are you ready to see the impossible?" And I said, "Yes, sir, Mr. Wizard. I want to see something impossible." And he took off his hat. He had this big top hat. And he took off his hat and he showed that there was nothing in his hat. Nothing whatsoever. It was just an empty hat. And when he put it back on his head, I said, "Look, Mr. Wizard, it's still empty." He said, "That's enough, kid." I was making fun, but that's okay. He showed his hat to be totally empty, kind of like my hat here. It's totally empty. And from that empty hat, there was totally nothing in the hat. He pulled from that hat something really amazing. He took from that empty hat and pulled out a little bunny. And I thought, wow, how did you get that little bunny out of an empty hat? I said, "Mr. Magician, that was pretty awesome. How'd you do that? That's impossible. You got a rabbit out of an empty hat. How could you have done that?" And he said, "I'm a wizard and I can do all magic." "I don't think so. I just think you tricked me." And he did. He had tricked me. But it seemed impossible. It seemed impossible that he could bring a rabbit, an honest to goodness real rabbit, out of that empty hat. This is my buddy Dusty. And Dusty doesn't like being in the hat, do you, buddy? He says it's when he's in there, it's impossible to get out until I let him out. Well, you know, God says He's going to do all these great things. The Bible tells us that He has a future and a hope for each one of us. A future that has great things. Future to prosper us. That means to make all things good for us. And we can trust Him. And we can persevere because it may not happen overnight. It may not happen right now, but it's going to happen. God always has these great plans for each one of us that eventually come true. You know, when I started following Jesus, 35 years ago, I went, wow, God's going to do great things with my life. But it wasn't like instantly that He changed everything. It took a while. And I had to persevere. I had to keep trusting in God, even when things didn't seem like I could make it through. Even when I would fall and mess up and I would have to ask Jesus to forgive me again, I would think, man, there's no way that I can finish this race. There's no way I can keep being a Christian and trusting God as much as I fall and as much as I mess up. But you know what? God is good, and He's gracious, and His grace covers all of our failures. And those failures are actually what God turns to good to use later to help other people, to help us. And every time we fall, we get right back up and we keep going. That's what perseverance means. It means to keep going no matter how many times we fall, no matter how many times we mess up, we get up, we ask God to forgive us and give us strength, and we move forward. So no matter how impossible things seem right now, I know we're still trapped in our houses. A lot of us can't go anywhere. And we would love to be at church where we could play goofy games in children's church and play on the playground and all those kind of things. But we're stuck at home. And it may seem like to you right now that this is never going to end. But you know what? We can persevere. We can keep on. We can stick to it all the way to see this thing through, because God, just like with all the other impossible things, God will see us through this as well. Tell you what, make sure that you go to the website and check out all the downloads we have for you. Lots more downloads this week with coloring pages and puzzle pages and activities for mom and dad to do with you, some games and races and stuff like that. So check out the website, and me and Dusty will see you next week.